Right. So, good morning. Book of Acts. What a book. Oh my days. It's like such a high octane sort of spiritual atmosphere that we get into as soon as we start reading the book of Acts. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because in some ways, the book of Acts can feel like quite a discouraging book to read, quite an intimidating book to read. And it's often presented as, this is the church at its very best, and we should all be like this. And actually, that can feel a little bit, like I said, intimidating, because you sort of read it and you think, I've never experienced anything like that in my life, and I don't see how we can get there from where we are as a church at the minute. And one of the things I'm going to suggest is actually the book of Acts is showing us how Jesus is at work in a in some ways, a very ordinary church, very ordinary people who make mistakes and are getting things wrong. But actually, Jesus is at work in and through that, and he's actually also continuing to teach and train and lead the church into being the body of people that he wants them to be. So that's kind of I suppose the atmosphere that I want this to be in. This isn't, this is so intimidating. This sets the standard so high we can never achieve this. But actually, this is a really encouraging book, because it shows us how Jesus continues to work through the life of the church in spite of our sin, but also actually getting us past that and helping us to grow in a generation to become increasingly the people that he's calling us to be. Okay, so that's kind of the atmosphere that I want this to be coming across in. All right, so Book of Acts, written by Luke, who was involved in Paul's team of missionaries at various points. But why did he write it? Why did he sit down and write the book of Acts? Okay, over the years, over the centuries, there have been two main kind of theories about why the book of Acts was written. All right, now the first, and I have to confess, this has a certain romantic appeal to me, is that Luke wrote his gospel and the book of Acts as part of the briefing papers for Paul's legal team as they are preparing for Paul's trial before Caesar at Rome. So that's kind of the context in which the book of Acts is written. Now, I find that really tantalizing as an idea. It makes sense of a number of really intriguing aspects in the book of Acts. For a start, why Luke addresses his gospel and Acts to most excellent Theophilus. Now, as you read through the book of Acts, that way of addressing people, most excellent, seems to be a formal address that is used in legal contexts and in defenses at trial. So if you look at Acts 24, verse 3, Paul, defending himself before Felix, addresses Felix as most excellent Felix. And in Acts 26, when he's defending himself against Festus, before Festus, again, he addresses Festus, most excellent Festus. It would also explain why Luke highlights the fact that his writing is based on eyewitness accounts. That's the sort of thing that makes a lot of sense in the context of a law court. It would explain why Acts focuses on Paul so exclusively once he comes on the scene. What happens to the other apostles? We often call it the Acts of the Apostles. Actually, most of the apostles get very, very little airtime at all in the book of Acts. Why is that? It would also explain why, as you read through both Luke's gospel and Acts, every time a Roman official engages with Christianity, they come away, first of all, really impressed, even if they don't convert themselves, but also articulating there's no legal grounds to imprison Christians or to restrict the life and the mission of the church, which again is important if Luke is looking to establish legal precedent. So Acts 26, verse 32, Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And it would also explain, I think, one of the biggest puzzles of all about the book of Acts, which is, why does it finish where it does? All right, it finishes with Paul waiting in Rome for his trial. And like, everybody's like, Ma, why did you not just tell us what happened in his trial? That's what the whole book's been working up towards. That's the climax. Why don't you tell us? And the simple answer would be because it hasn't happened yet. Paul is waiting for trial, and the book of Acts has been written as part of helping his legal team understand who Paul is, where he's come from, and what this Christianity thing is all about. So that's one of the main ideas as to why Luke and Acts was written. Some people find that too fanciful a construct, and they just say, look, Luke is simply bestowing a gift on the church. Theophilus simply means lover of God. It comes from two words, theos, God, and phileo, I love, and Theophilus just means somebody who loves God. And Luke Acts is just being written for the benefit and for the building up and for the encouraging of those who love God. And you know, you read through the book of Acts, and it does encourage, and it does inspire, and it does build us up, right? The story of the years following Pentecost, it's exciting, it's inspiring, it's a challenging story, and Luke wants us to know it. Maybe in part, he's writing, you know, he's a Gentile himself, and he is writing to safeguard the place of the Gentiles in the life of the church. You know, that there seems in those early years to have been a constant sense of questioning about whether the Gentiles should be included on the basis that they are. And maybe one of the things Luke has got going on in the book of Acts is he's just wanting to remind the church constantly that everyone is included in the church on the basis of faith alone in Christ alone. Whoever you are, wherever you come from, whatever your background, whatever your history, we are all included in the church on the basis of faith alone in Christ alone. It's a great story, and it's a story that Luke actually was a part of. When we start reading through the book of Acts in a couple of days, just keep an eye out for the times when Luke slips into telling the story from the first person plural. So he talks about, you know, we did this, and this happened to us. There are times when Luke is with Paul on his missionary journeys. But it is such an amazing story. And I think one of the dangers in reading the book of Acts is that you just get caught up in the drama of the story, and you just read it as a story. So, you know, you look at a book like, you know, Romans, and you think, okay, that's where you go to learn theology. That's where you go to learn who God is and what the gospel is. And then you just read Acts as a story. But actually, I think Acts, it is a story, it is a narrative, it is telling us history, but it's one that is pregnant with theological meaning and truth. And there's so much for us to learn about who God is and how he relates to his people and his purposes for the world. All right. Now, like I said at the start, we don't want to be setting Acts up as something that intimidates us and leaves us feeling like, oh, there's no point. We'll never be like that. I really don't think that's the way Luke would want us to read the book of Acts. Sometimes you get this idea that if only we could get back to the days of Acts, that would be amazing, wouldn't it? Well, I don't know. I mean, in some ways it would be, but it was a very, very human church. And with that, it's a church that wrestled with all kinds of failure and sin and fragility. I mean, just read through the letters that were written to the churches during this time and see some of the stuff that they're having to struggle with and negotiate. You know, people are confused about what it means to be a Christian. They don't always know what to believe or how to live. You know, in the book of Acts, you see people struggling to work out how to do what Jesus told them to do. You see people who fall short of their own stated vision for what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be a church. You see this incredible mix of, on the one hand, courageous obedience, but on the other hand, there's a real floundering. And actually, the church in the book of Acts is a really messy place to be sometimes, which makes, I think, Acts a very dynamic book to read. Because on the one hand, it is challenging, but on the other hand, it's a very encouraging book because we're watching people who are very like us aspire to a vision for church life that we would never dare to believe possible if left to our own devices. All right, but I really do want us to recognize that, you know, these weren't sort of superhuman people in a sense, that they really were people who we can probably identify with far more than we realize. I mean, you take Acts chapter 1, obviously where the book starts. And one of the first things you see is the disciples actually being rebuked by Jesus. You know, they're really struggling to get their heads around what Jesus has called them to be a part of and what it is that Jesus is calling them to do. And there are huge questions, I think, as well, about whether Peter isn't actually being a bit presumptuous in Act 1 when he tries to fill the place left by Judas. You know, as you read through the book of Acts and the rest of the New Testament, it kind of feels like actually, maybe Paul was supposed to be the apostle that would replace Judas, not Matthias. You know, so in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul actually talks about himself as an apostle born out of time. So straight away, you see the church making these really quite significant errors of judgment. But then the temptation is to go, yes, but then Pentecost, and everything comes good after Pentecost, right? And I want to say, well, yeah, Pentecost, definitely a game changer. But in terms of the mission of the church, these guys are still some way off learning everything that Jesus has to teach them. They're still some way off being the church that Jesus has called them to be. And I think this is a really important thing to grasp as we start reading through the book of Acts in a couple of days, that even after Pentecost, Jesus is still discipling his disciples, or he's still teaching them, he's still equipping them, he's still leading his church gently but resolutely into the life and mission that he's ordained for it. All right, I do think that will make Acts a much more encouraging book for us to read if we can trace out how that's happening. But we can learn from it without feeling that this is something fundamentally beyond our grasp as a church. All right, so let me give you some examples of that from the early chapters of the book of Acts. All right, now the obvious place to start on this is the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, which is where the church kind of takes her place in what has been God's plan and purposes since he called Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. Remember where he said, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So, you know, right at the start, that's God's plan, that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And we see that stretching forth into the everlasting ages of the new creation. Revelation 7, a great multitude that no one could count from every nation, every tribe, every people, every language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. Okay, now Acts fits right into that plan of God, because Acts chapter 1 verse 8, just before the ascension, Jesus tells them, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. All right, the church is about to be sent out to be the blessing to all the peoples on the earth. All right, now, important in that is, again, Acts 1, Jesus' ascension has redrawn the spiritual geography of creation. Okay, this is an important point. Throughout the Old Testament, Jesus is focused, his inheritance is the promised land. All right, that's where the lordship of Jesus is kind of recognized and lent into and experienced. But now, as Jesus is ascended, well, in the language of Psalm 2, he's exalted as king, and the Father says to his Son, ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance and the ends of the earth your possession. And it's as if, you know, Jesus's focus moves off being like quite tightly engaged with this one nation in Israel, and now incorporates the whole of the earth, all the nations of the world. And so the shift between Old and New Testament really hinges around Jesus's ascension, and it shifts between Israel being Jesus's inheritance to the whole earth now, as Christ is exalted over all the nations. And it's no longer, okay, if you want to be a Christian, you want to worship Jesus, you have to come to Israel. You have to come. It's now Israel is coming to you. Okay, and that's kind of the dynamic of the book of Acts. We're taking the gospel to Jerusalem, all Judea, Samaria, and now to the ends of the earth, which is a pretty big job, however you look at it, which is why Jesus had told them to wait. Luke 24, verse 59. Wait, I'm going to send you what my Father has promised. stay in the city, in Jerusalem, until you have been clothed with power from on high. And that's the massive thing that's being done on the day of Pentecost. Pentecost is, of course, the ancient church's sort of harvest festival. It's the bringing in of the harvest, and it's the providing for the poor and stuff like that. And you see all of that being fulfilled in the book of Acts. But the Spirit is given to the church on the day of Pentecost to equip her for the task of mission that lies ahead of them, to equip them to take the gospel into all the nations of the world. And that's why the gift of tongues, or the gift of languages, is such a big deal on the day of Pentecost. Because if they're going to take the gospel into the nations of the world, they're taking it into cultures and languages that they've never experienced before, let alone learned. And it's like, okay, guys, we're going to go into all the world, but we're going to need to take 3 or 4 years first so that we can do all these culture studies and language studies. It's like, that would be rubbish. No. So the Spirit supernaturally gifts the apostles with this gift of ability to speak and to be understood in other languages. And it's symbolized by tongues of fire. And what that means is we can get on with preaching the gospel straight away, wherever we end up. All right. And that's what happens. Immediately, they start preaching the gospel to this multi-ethnic, multicultural crowd that is before them on the day of Pentecost. And now, after our coffee break, we'll take a little bit of a look at what that message actually, what is the gospel that the apostles actually preach in the book of Acts. But just before we do that, I want to have a little bit of a look at the life of the church that comes about as a result of the preaching of the gospel. Because early on in Acts, that's something Luke keeps coming back to. He keeps almost interrupting his story about mission to say, oh, but look at the church, look at the life of the church. There's the first time he does it is a famous little section in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. And I think Luke's point is that the church is the evidence, it's the proof of the truth of the gospel that Peter has just preached on the day of Pentecost. I think that's how it's working. It's like we claim that the gospel breaks the power of sin, that it reconciles us to God, that through his death and resurrection, Jesus has inaugurated the new creation in which everything is brought to unity under him, that we can share in that. And those are big, big claims to make as we preach the gospel. That the question is, how can anyone know that it's true? Right? How can we know that it's real? And Luke's answer is, well, look at the church that the gospel brings into being. Look at the way these people live. You will not see that anywhere else in this old, fallen, cursed creation, because it can't be achieved anywhere else. All right? This kind of life requires the presence of the Spirit of God. Look at the worship that's going on. These are people who are connected to God, who are in relationship with God, who know God. Look at the new creation life that they're living. The damage that's been done by sin has been reversed and undone. The power of sin is broken. And these are people who are united under Jesus and brought into a radically different set of relationships with each other. It's like, that's how you know the gospel is true, because it does the things that it says it can do. All right, you see it again in chapter 4. Luke writes this: all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own. They shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. God's grace was so powerfully at work in them that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them and brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Now, people have tried to recreate that kind of community without the gospel. All right, they've seen it and they've gone, that's it, that's the way we should live. And they've tried to do it without Jesus. I mean, the most famous person, of course, was Karl Marx, who was like, yep, that's how we should live. But he tried to do it without Jesus. But the point is, you need Jesus to redeem us and to transform us as humans before we can ever live that kind of life. All right. And if you try to take Jesus out of the equation, you try to take the gospel out of the equation, and you try to bring this about by some kind of political revolution or by some kind of government policy, well, what we've discovered is you need armies and secret police and informers and gulags if you want to force people to live like this without Jesus. It can't be done. All right. It results in the death of culture and the death of millions of people if you try to do this without Jesus. Right? You cannot deal with the questions of social injustice and greed and selfishness without the death and resurrection of Jesus. You can't have this life without the gospel. All right. Now, like I said, though, it's a deeply human church. All right. And there's no rose-tinted glasses. There's no naivety here. We're not in the new creation yet, although we'll begin to experience whispers and echoes of it. And so when you get into Acts 5, we're shown this contrast between Barnabas on the one hand and Ananias and Sapphira on the other, who are still shaped by greed and by a desire for reputation. They care so much about what other people think of them. And of course, we know the story of Acts 5. We know the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And it ends with God actually striking both Ananias and Sapphira dead. And we're often a bit shocked by that. Self-promotion, desire for reputation, greed, selfishness. Those things are so common in our experience of people, even of other Christians, even of ourselves, that we're quite sort of surprised to see God act in judgment and discipline against it. But he's making a statement. The Lord is making a statement right at the start of this new chapter of the church's story. He's saying, look, this is so precious to me. All right, this vision of a life shaped by and enabled by the gospel. It's so important to show the nations the truth of the gospel. You don't get to mess with the life of my church. You don't get to bring sin into it and then just walk away as if nothing of significance has happened. Right? It's like if we can get the book of Acts into our soul, we'll end up with this kind of really rich and quite awesome and terrifying vision of a God that you don't play games with this God or with his church. And the God who disciplined the church in the book of Acts is still our God today. And I think that's something we need to constantly wrestle with and seek to come to terms with. But the death of Ananias and Sapphira has this huge impact on the church, kind of obviously enough in a way, right? And so in Acts chapter 6, when now the church is wanting to appoint people who can oversee managing the church's finances and resources, they're like, oh, but we don't want to put somebody like Ananias and Sapphira in that kind of role. All right, that would be a disaster. What they actually want are people who are spiritually tried and tested, who have a kind of proven spiritual maturity. Well, in the words of the apostles, people who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. And it's like, all right, if we're going to deal with money in the life of the church, that's the kind of person who we want to put in a place of authority and influence on those sorts of things. And so in Acts 6, we read the story of these 7 guys who are elected to this role. And they're like spiritual giants in the life of the church. And it's not at all surprising that we see such spiritually qualified individuals, also engaging in pastoring and discipling and preaching and in evangelism. And Luke follows up the appointment of these 7 deacons with stories of a couple of them just on what they're doing in terms of evangelism, as well as overseeing the care of the needy within the life of the church. And they're not just random stories, okay? These are stories that fit very precisely into Luke's agenda of showing how the gospel ends up being taken to the ends of the earth. Because, we're in Act 6, and that hasn't happened yet, right? The church hasn't really left Jerusalem yet in some ways, all right? But there are 4 or 5 things that Jesus is going to do that are going to take the church now from being quite a small, geographically focused movement into something now that is ready and able to take the gospel, like he said at the start, to the ends of the earth. All right, so there are 5 things that happen. Let me just run through those quickly, and then we'll stop for a couple of minutes for a chance to refill our coffee mugs and stuff. All right, so what are the 5 things that happen? The first is there's persecution. Okay, now again, we'll come back and look at this a bit more carefully after the coffee break. But following Stephen's evangelistic ministry in Acts 7, there is a persecution breaks out that is so intense that it drives the majority of the church out of Jerusalem. All right, and in fact, only the apostles are spiritually strong enough to withstand the hostility that is unleashed against the life of the church. And it would be so tempting if you imagine if you were in the church in Jerusalem and you saw everybody leave apart from the leaders. And you would think, that's it, man. The church is over. That's the decimation of that. But actually, no, it's not. In some ways, it's the beginning of the church that Jesus wants them to be. Because now they are out of Jerusalem and are going into the nations of the world. Albeit that they've literally had to be dragged out of Jerusalem, kicking and screaming. That's the first thing, is persecution in Jerusalem. The second thing is the conversion of an Ethiopian. All right, and this picks up on a story from Philip's evangelistic ministry. Now, there's a history with the gospel in Ethiopia that stretches back through Solomon and goes right back actually to Moses himself. All right, there's a deep link with Ethiopia and Jesus. It's really interesting. And even here in the days of the book of Acts, Ethiopia is still sending top government officials to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover and to wait for the coming of the one the Passover lamb represents. And so this is a hugely significant conversion. And this guy takes the gospel back to North Africa and East Africa. And that's important, because actually the church in Africa for the next 500 years is kind of the powerhouse of Christianity. All right, all the big names that come to us, well, not all of them, but a lot of them that come to us from the first 5 centuries of the church, guys like Tertullian and Augustine and Athanasius, they're all Africans. All right, so the conversion of this African in Acts chapter 8, massively significant for the growth of the church and the taking of the gospel to the nations of the world. Okay, the third thing is the conversion of Saul in Acts chapter 9. Utterly traumatic for Paul when Jesus meets him on the road to Damascus. He's completely incapacitated, isn't he? And he's blinded, and his eyes never recover from this. You know, later in the book of Acts, he's not able to recognize the high priest. And you're like, well, why not? It's because, well, his eyes never recovered from being confronted with the glory of the ascended Jesus. But his whole worldview is turned upside down. And he moves famously from being this guy who's like, his whole life is about destroying the church, to actually, you know, once he's baptized, his immediate response is to go out and start tell people about Jesus, right? His instinct now is to be totally evangelistic. And he goes to Damascus for 3 years, during which he is instructed, get this, he's instructed in the way of discipleship by Jesus himself. You read about that in Galatians chapter 1, which goes some way to explaining why he's able to write these immense letters that speak to the life of the church for generations. All right, so the next thing, the fourth thing that happens is the conversion of Cornelius. So Saul's conversion means an end to kind of certainly that initial wave of persecution. And Peter takes the opportunity of that piece to go on a bit of a preaching tour. And again, really famously, how he ends up in the house of Cornelius, a Gentile, and preaches about Jesus. And the whole household is kind of baptized and receive the Spirit in a way that is designed to remind the church that of their own experience at Pentecost. It's like God is saying, look, I accept Gentiles on the basis of faith in Christ, in the same way as I accept Jews on the basis of faith in Christ. And actually, Peter stays. We read this, Acts 9:43. Peter ends up living in Joppa for a while. He doesn't go back to Jerusalem. He stays pastoring these new Gentile churches that are beginning to develop. All right, and the fifth thing that really sets the church up to become an organization that can take the gospel to the ends of the earth is the planting of a very particular church in Antioch, which you read about in Acts 11, and then again in Acts 13. And that's actually where Saul and Barnabas end up on the leadership team. And that church at Antioch is going to be the epicenter of Gentile mission. It's a very young church, but straight away it's massively international. And it's already characterized by deep worship, prayer, and fasting, and by the Spirit is taking the initiative to send out leaders as workers and evangelists and missionaries. It's hugely challenging, I think, as a picture of a church. But let me just say this. It's only now in Acts 13 that the church has been discipled by Jesus sufficiently to be a body of people who are in fact now going to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. And we'll come back and think a little bit about that after coffee. Okay, welcome back. So I tried to show in the first half just a little bit about how the church is grown by Jesus into the kind of spiritual movement and organization that's actually able to do what Jesus says and take the gospel even to the ends of the earth. It's not an overnight phenomenon. It's not like, okay, there was the day of Pentecost and then everything was good. It took the Lord's direct intervention at a number of key moments. But now we're ready, as it were, and taking the gospel to the ends of the earth starts to become much more of a reality. And in the second half of this morning's talk, what I want us to reflect a little bit is, what does that mission and evangelism look like in the book of Acts? What does it mean to be somebody who witnesses to Jesus among the nations of the world? And what I want to say is, as you start reading through the book of Acts in a couple of days' time, my hunch is you will find a lot that's out of step with our received wisdom and our assumptions about what we think evangelism is about. Now, I'm really resisting the temptation to get into kind of like exhaustive exegesis at this stage. But I'll try just to flag up some things for you to keep an eye out for as you read through Acts on and off over the next few weeks, okay? And the first thing is and this is going to sound a little bit strange, but actually, what is the gospel? All right, what is the message that we are entrusted with? What is the message through which we bear witness to Jesus in the nations? Now, let me just be a little bit provocative here, just to kind of help you register how out of step we might be with Acts on this. And it's just to point out that there's actually, throughout the entire book of Acts, there is no mention of the love of God, which is an extraordinary observation when you think this is the book, more than any other, that shows us the church on mission, that gives us samples of the evangelistic preaching of the apostles. The absence of the word love is a really intriguing one, isn't it? And it's worth reading as we read through Acts, just asking, what is the message the apostles are preaching? Now, there are lots of different facets of it that come to the fore depending on the situation they're in and who they're speaking to. But it is worth keeping an eye out for how often ideas like the exaltation of Jesus, how often phrases like the kingdom of God appear in the apostles' teaching and preaching. One of their big things seems to be about how the resurrection proves that Jesus is who he says he is, which means you don't want to oppose him. That seems to be a big emphasis in the evangelists' preaching of the gospel. That if you persist in opposing Jesus, who is the king that God has established, then you will face him in judgment. And again, judgment is a theme that comes through again and again and again in the preaching of the apostles. All right? And therefore, there is a response that's being called for by the apostles constantly, and it's repentance. Repentance. That is the big word in the book of Acts. You need to turn away from being involved in this world that is opposed to Jesus. You know, that's kind of fundamentally what becoming a Christian is part of what becoming a Christian is about. It's not, Christianity isn't an addition to the life that you're already living. It's always presented in Acts as this is a radically alternative way of life. Peter puts it like this in Acts 2:40. You need to save yourself from this corrupt generation. All right, don't stay as a part of it, but now add Jesus into the mix. It's like, come out of that, be part of something totally different. Come away from that old creation and its destiny and step into a new creation and a destiny that is focused on the future with Jesus. All right, and that transition out of this world and into the church, which is what being a Christian is about, that is affected through baptism, right? And all the way through Acts, ordinarily, that is how you respond to the gospel, right? You see it at Pentecost, that the Ethiopian guy in Acts 8, it's what happens at Philippi. Lydia and her household are baptized. The jailer and his household are baptized. That's how people respond to the gospel. Huge topic, can't say more about it now. But again, just want you to think about if you were inviting somebody to become a Christian, where would baptism feature in that? All right, so the first thing to be watching out for as we read through Acts is what is the message the apostles are actually preaching and how much does that resonate with what we tend to think of as the gospel. But the second thing, and this is huge in the book of Acts, it's the church's willingness to suffer in order to make the gospel known. In fact, I would say that Luke sees, and the church in Acts sees, suffering and persecution not as something to be avoided, but as inevitable if the gospel is to be heard. You cannot preach the gospel without incurring suffering and persecution. I think that's one of the big messages that hits us from the book of Acts. There's this sense that Jesus had to suffer in order for the gospel to become a reality. There would be no gospel without the cross. And the church, likewise now, and Jesus in the church has to suffer if that gospel is going to be made known among the nations. There's no other way to do this. There is no alternative. Now, when suffering hits the church, sometimes Christians are delivered in miraculous ways. Other times they're strengthened to endure suffering. Sometimes they flee. Sometimes they stay. Sometimes they're martyred. But actually, suffering is a regular and consistent part of the experience of the church on mission. Right? And actually, that comes from Jesus. Acts chapter 9, verse 16. Jesus is talking about Paul, who's going to be massively used in evangelism. And so Jesus says this, I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. All right, here's this guy. He's going to be an evangelist. What does Jesus say? He must suffer. That is part of evangelism and mission in the book of Acts. I think one of the most compelling examples of that is in Acts chapter 21. You got this guy called Agabus who turns up. He's a prophet, and he prophesies that if Paul goes into Jerusalem, he's going to be arrested and imprisoned and handed over to the Gentile authorities. Now, I've often thought if somebody said, right, to me, Prentice, if you do this particular mission or this evangelistic event, you're going to be imprisoned. I would probably sit back and think, all right, thanks for the warning. And I would assume that God was telling me not to do that. All right. Paul's response is, quote, fine, I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die for the name of Jesus. And he's like, thanks for the warning. At least now I can make sure I'm prepared. And he goes into the very situation where it has just been told him suffering waits for him and persecution. It's so different. So often our working theology is, oh, God would never want me to suffer. But in Acts, they rejoice that they are counted worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. It's a very different atmosphere to the church's life and mission. Now, again, there are a handful of times when the apostles or the church, for whatever reason, choose to avoid suffering. And it's always worth asking, what's going on here? Why is Paul willing to use his Roman citizenship at Philippi to avoid suffering, but not elsewhere? Those are interesting questions that will help unlock what's going on in certain parts of the book of Acts for us. Now, one of the things that Luke wants to show us is that when the church suffers, there are two dimensions that we need to be aware of. The first is the very human dimension. You've got people with vested interests, usually financial, political, sometimes even religious and spiritual interests, and they recognize that the gospel is threatening their privileged position. It's threatening their income, it's threatening their status, their power, their influence, which is really interesting that Christianity, in the book of Acts, Christianity is always seen as a threat by people who hold positions of power and influence in the world. It's a social revolution, and people recognize that as soon as they hear the gospel being preached. So there's the very human dimension, but there's a spiritual dimension. There are spiritual forces at work opposing the advance of the kingdom of God through the nations. Now, it's interesting because, again, you'll see this as you read through the book of Acts. It's never a direct focus. All right, the apostles never kind of do what we might think of as spiritual warfare. They never go hunting, what's the territorial spirit here? And there's nothing like that. What the apostles do is they preach the gospel. And if there is an overt spiritual reaction to that, if some kind of unclean spirit or demon announces itself as a response to the preaching of the gospel, they deal with that in a very, very forthright manner. So you see it in Acts 16, verse 18, for example, where a demon manifests itself. And Paul simply says, like, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her. At that moment, the spirit left her. And then as soon as that's dealt with, what do? They get back to preaching the gospel. All right. And in the book of Acts, that's how the demonic is dealt with. And the reason it's dealt like that is because Jesus had taught the apostles how dangerous it was to drive out demons in situations where people don't become Christians. Right? You can read about that back in Luke chapter 11. You can end up in a worse spiritual condition than they started in if a demon is cast out of somebody who doesn't then accept Jesus Christ as Lord. Anyway, look, the response of the church to persecution is generally twofold. Okay, one is that generally they want to keep preaching the gospel, but the other thing that they'll often do is pray. And again, it's just worth bearing in mind that as you read through the book of Acts, how often the church's reflexive response to persecution and suffering is to get together and to pray together as a church. It's interesting what they pray, because they don't get together and say, okay, God, please deliver us from trouble. Oh, God, please keep us out of trouble. We don't want to suffer. No, what they pray is, Lord, give us boldness so that we can keep testifying to the glory of Christ in spite of and in the face of suffering and hostility and persecution and trouble. All right, so that whatever form the opposition takes, whether it's directly spiritual, whether it's social or political, whether it's official, or whether it's kind of mob violence, that's what they do. They pray, they keep preaching the gospel, and it's never, all right, let's keep our heads down, or okay, look, we've kicked up a bit of a dust storm here. Let's just be quiet for a while until the dust settles, and then maybe we'll be able to preach again. No. The idea that they would not preach the gospel, the idea that they would not do evangelism, just never seems to enter the heads of the church in the book of Acts. All right? Their assumption is, wherever we are, whoever we are with, we will talk to them about Jesus. But they know that actually the gospel doesn't always win people for Jesus. Sometimes it actually drives people further into the darkness, and that often provokes a volatile reaction. But they know that, it's war, right? This is the gospel invading the nations. Of course, there's going to be opposition. All right, and again, it's worth, just as you see the church in Acts experiencing opposition and persecution and enduring suffering, just be asking yourself, how are they making sense of that? All right, how do they react to that, respond to that? Where do they see God in the midst of that? Because so often for us, suffering it inspires doubt, fear, anxiety. It intimidates us and wants to silence us in our preaching of the gospel. And it's just worth seeing how different the church's thinking and reaction to suffering and persecution is as we read through the book of Acts. Now, again, there are exceptions. There are, and they really stand out in the book of Acts, these moments when actually the gospel isn't preached. And it seems to me there are three situations in the book of Acts where the church stops doing evangelism. All right, and just watch for these. It's really interesting. And the first is when people make an informed decision to reject Christ. All right, so you see this, for example, in Acts 13 at Pisidian Antioch. All right, this is what Luke writes. The Jewish leaders incited God-fearing women of high standard and leading men of the city. They stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them from their region. So they shook the dust off their feet as a warning to them and went to Iconium. All right, now it's really interesting. It's like, they've been preaching at Pisidian Antioch. The people know what they're doing. They're making an informed decision to reject Jesus. And the church goes, fine. If that's your call, we don't spend any more time here. All right. And again, that's something Jesus taught the disciples back in Luke chapter 9, verse 5. If people do not welcome you, said Jesus, leave their town, shake the dust off your feet as testimony against them. I think it's one of the most painful lessons in evangelism is that when people make an informed decision to reject or oppose the gospel, don't get caught up with them. All right. Sometimes we sort of feel like, okay, we just need to keep going here. We need to stay in relationship. We need to keep on and on and on and on presenting Jesus, even though these are people who've made the decision to reject him. Actually, the apostles do what Jesus said and move on. Right. Now, the second situation is there's a moment in the book of Acts when the Spirit of Jesus tells Paul not to go somewhere to preach the gospel. And you're thinking, that is so weird, right? The standing orders of Jesus are share the gospel wherever you are with whoever you can find. But then you get to something like Acts chapter 16, verse 7, and Luke tells us about Paul and his missionary team. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. And you're like, whoa, the Spirit is like, do not preach the gospel over there. And you're like, what's going on with that? Well, actually, you need to read on into the epistles of Peter to find out what's going on. Because actually, this is how Peter starts his letter. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiles, scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. All right, so actually, it's not that Jesus, the Spirit is saying to Paul, don't preach the gospel, Paul. It's saying that's somebody else's responsibility. I've assigned that region to Peter, and he's going to preach the gospel in Bithynia. And what actually happens is the Spirit redirects Paul into Europe. And Paul brings the gospel from Asia to Europe in Acts chapter 16, verse 9. And it's really interesting because Christianity today is often seen as a European religion. Actually, it doesn't come to Europe until, Acts chapter 16. All right, now the third situation where the church doesn't preach the gospel is when the unity of the church is threatened. All right, now you see this in Acts chapter 15. All right, there are big questions being raised in Acts 15 about the nature of the gospel and about the nature of the church. So what happens? All right, all the apostles stop mission. They all stop doing evangelism among the nations of the world, and they all come back to Jerusalem in order to hammer this out. It's important that we know what the gospel is. It's important that we understand what the church is. And it's only when that's all resolved at the Council of Jerusalem that actually everybody goes back now to preaching the gospel. It's extraordinary, isn't it? The absolute priority of the unity of the church. It's like, if the unity of the church is threatened, that's more important to deal with than preaching the gospel. You're thinking, oh my goodness, that's extraordinary, isn't it? And this idea of the unity of the church, again, watch for that. It comes through again and again and again in the book of Acts. Not just within the life of a congregation, but universally. All right, you see it. I think one of the best expressions of that sense of Catholicity or the universality of the church is Paul's collection from churches, the Gentile churches, to ease the situation of the church in Judea that's undergone persecution and is now going through a time of famine. And it's like, as soon as churches are planted, they have this sense of belonging to something much bigger than themselves. And they're immediately, it's like one of the first things that happens as the churches are planted. Immediately, they're giving money to support the church elsewhere in the world. All right. And it's a unity that transcends culture. Again, you see this again and again in the book of Acts. And I think the idea is that the church is God's answer to the Tower of Babel. And again, Luke periodically stops and really draws attention to the fact that the church is this multicultural, multi-ethnic phenomenon. That people from different backgrounds who are worshiping together and who are doing mission together. You see it at the start of Acts chapter 20, where, you know, you've got, there's a guy called Secundus. Now that's not a name. That's the title that you give to a slave. So you've got people who are slave and free. You've got Jew and Gentile. You've got people from different continents, different races, different ethnicities who are all on mission together. And it's a unity that doesn't come naturally. It's a supernatural thing that the Spirit engenders and makes possible. And it's almost like Luke's saying, look, church is the answer to racism in our society and every other form of social division. But again, notice where it fails. Notice where sin kind of undermines this unity. So in Acts 15, you have this huge council that kind of works so hard to make sure that the unity of the church is preserved. And then the very next thing that happens is that Paul and Barnabas fall out personally over whether to take John Mark on a mission trip with them or not. And so you kind of got this huge thing about unity, and then you've got the church splitting. You've got a mission team that splits because of a falling out over a particular issue. But again, I want you to see this. You know, even through failure and sin, God is at work, and that's a really obvious example of how that is. Because now there are two mission teams that are going out in different directions and taking the gospel throughout the nations of the world. All right, so this is what one of the things I want to say as we get into reading the book of Acts over the next few weeks is kind of not to think of that as something that is fundamentally different from our experience of church. I think there are elements of it are different. I think there is an aspect of the life of the church in the book of Acts that is tied to the foundational role of the apostles. But I think we have a lot more in common with the book of Acts than we might realize. And actually what we're seeing is, here is Jesus taking very ordinary people, redeeming them, and over a period of years, training them and equipping them and intervening to make them the people that he's calling them to be. And I think if we can pick out how Jesus is doing that, then actually that's really encouraging for us, because we'll see that Jesus is doing the same things in our own experience of church all these years later. All right, now it's what is it? 5:02. I need to wrap up. The whole last section of the book of Acts is actually taken up with the account of Paul's journey to Rome. Right? I don't need to tell you the story. You'll read it over the next few weeks as you go through the book of Acts. But there is a sense of, here is Paul. He's going to the center of the Roman Empire. He's going to stand before Caesar for trial. And you just know that he is going to bear witness to Jesus when he gets there. All right. So that's in a sense, that's what the book of Acts is working towards. Now, it's interesting to notice we've come a long way in those 28 chapters. Back in Acts chapter 2, verse 47, Luke's summary of the church was that it enjoyed the favor of all the people. By the time Paul is in Rome, 28 chapters later, what the summary statement is, we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect. So it's really interesting. Over the 30 years or so covered by the book of Acts, it goes from the church goes from something that enjoys the favor of all the people to becoming something where people everywhere are talking against it. Now, when you see Paul at Rome and on the journey to Rome, I think it's easy to make one of two mistakes. Firstly, is you can watch Paul's journey to Rome and think, what a waste. What a waste of time. At one point, he spends 2 years imprisoned because the person who was imprisoning him was hoping for a bride that never came. at one point he's left in prison because somebody else's political agenda and cynical pragmatism means actually it serves their purposes that Paul's left in prison. And you watch these long journeys by ship, and you're thinking this is all time where Paul isn't out there preaching and planting churches and bearing witness to Christ throughout the nations of the world. What a waste. But actually, in the wisdom of God, all of this is critical to the advance of the gospel, the building up of the church, the fulfilling of Jesus's own prophecy in Acts 23, that Paul would bear witness to him at Rome. And my hunch is that through those trials and frustrations that Paul is experiencing, Jesus is actually preparing Paul for the struggles that await him at Rome and beyond. And don't forget that it is during those times of imprisonment and journeying that Paul actually writes many of the letters that we now have in the New Testament. Right now, that's one mistake, is to think, oh, it's all such a waste. But actually, the other mistake is that we get triumphalistic. And it's like, oh, right, here it is. The gospel is at the heart of the Roman Empire. It's game over. The Roman Empire is going to crumble into the dust and the church is going to take over the world. And in a sense, I think that's kind of dangerous as well, because we forget that actually it is through suffering that the gospel triumphs. It is through his suffering that Paul is able to take the gospel where he goes to. And even to get the gospel to Rome, Paul has to suffer. And actually, it's because he suffers that he is able to grasp so deeply the gospel of a suffering and crucified Messiah, which is why he's able to teach the churches across the ages in the way he does. All right, so let me finish with this. All right. On the way to Rome, Luke takes some time at the start of Acts 28 to tell us about a shipwreck where Paul ends up on the island of Malta. And he just gives us a very odd and very tantalizing little story. So let me just finish with this. It's Acts chapter 28, verses 3 to 5. So they've been shipwrecked. They've all been washed up on this island. And Paul gathers a pile of brushwood. And as he puts it on the fire, a viper is driven out by the heat and fastens itself on his hands. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul, says Luke, shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. I think as Luke comes to the end of Acts, it's just this little picture that captures for him what the whole book of Acts has been about. All right, one of the things you see as you go through Acts is the way in which the apostles are at pains to show that everything they are teaching and preaching is what the Old Testament has always preached and taught. In fact, Paul actually says, "I say nothing beyond which, the apostles and the prophets, Moses and the prophets also spoke to." He's like, I'm not saying anything new. This is all in the Old Testament. Everything I'm saying is in the Old Testament, including then, of course, that moment in Genesis 3 where there is the promise of one who is born of a woman who will crush the head of a serpent. And there's a little bit of me that just wonders if in this little story of Paul shaking the serpent off his hand into the fire, a little bit of me wonders if Luke is smiling a cheeky little grin to himself and saying, "That was so cool that night." It sort of sums up everything. The old serpent trying to stop the preaching of the gospel, doing everything he can to hurt us and kill us. But because we follow Jesus, we simply shake it off and carry on regardless. And it's a little picture. It's like, what's the book of Acts about? It's about the defeat and the shaking off and the judgment of Satan as he gives way before the advancing gospel and the kingdom of God. And of course, that's what we're seeing as we read through Acts. Satan is bound. He's unable to stop the spread of the gospel. He's helpless as the kingdom of God advances, as The king installed in Zion receives the nations as his inheritance, takes the ends of the earth as his possession. He claims his inheritance through all that he continues to do in and through the life and mission of the church. And that is the book of Acts, the triumph of Jesus, a triumph that we share in as we bear witness to Jesus amongst the nations of the world. And that's it.